Rob Reiner spent his life shaping stories where decency mattered, where people stumbled yet still reached for one another, where love survived misunderstanding. He directed films that became shared emotional landmarks, works audiences returned to when they wanted to believe that kindness was not naive, only difficult. Yet behind a man who orchestrated those carefully balanced emotions lived a father who discovered, slowly and painfully, that real life does not follow a script, and that love does not grant control. I can direct a film, but I cannot direct my child's life. That sentence, quiet and almost apologetic, would later echo far beyond the room in which it was spoken. It was not a line designed for drama, and it was never meant to be remembered. It emerged from a pause, from a breath taken too late, from the weight of something Rob Reiner had carried privately for decades. In that single admission lived a truth he had resisted acknowledging for most of his life. Success offers no immunity against helplessness, and fame cannot shield a parent from fear. To the public, Rob Reiner was certainty itself. He stood behind the camera with authority, confidence, and an instinctive understanding of human rhythm. He knew when to let silence linger, when to break it, when to trust the audience to feel what was not spoken. But as a father, certainty dissolved. What replaced it was a quiet vigilance, the kind that never announces itself, the kind that learns to live with unanswered questions. When whispers began circulating after his death about a tragedy inside his own family, those who truly understood his life knew this much. Whatever had happened, it did not begin suddenly, and it was not born of neglect or indifference. It grew in the spaces where love met limits. Rob Reiner's family history was not an ordinary one. His father, Carl Reiner, was a towering presence in American comedy, a man whose influence stretched across generations of performers and writers. That legacy was not enforced, but it was unavoidable. Rob grew up learning that humor could be humane, that stories carried responsibility, that choices mattered. When he became a father himself, those lessons remained close, shaping not only how he worked, but how he believed life should unfold. He trusted stability, structure, and love. He believed that a supportive environment, paired with opportunity, would be enough. His son, Nick Reiner, was born into a world where doors opened easily and expectations arrived uninvited. From the outside, it looked like privilege. From the inside, it often felt like pressure without language. There was no singular moment when things broke, no dramatic collapse. Instead, there were small shifts subtle enough to dismiss. Later nights, shorter conversations, a growing absence that did not yet look like danger. Rob Reiner, like many parents, told himself that adolescence came with distance, that independence sometimes wore the mask of withdrawal. What he did not yet understand was that those quiet changes marked the beginning of a battle he could not fight on his son's behalf. Nick would later struggle with addiction, entering treatment again and again, cycling through hope and disappointment in a rhythm that exhausted everyone involved. Rob never framed this as betrayal or failure. In the rare moments he spoke publicly, his language was careful, almost restrained, as if he feared that speaking too loudly might turn pain into spectacle. He waited. He showed up. He listened. And slowly, he learned a lesson that many parents only grasp after years of resistance. Effort does not guarantee outcome. 2 weeks before his death, Rob Reiner allowed himself to say something he had always known but rarely voiced. Not as an accusation, not as despair, but as fact. That sometimes, no matter how much you love your child, you reach a boundary you cannot cross. This was not resignation. It was clarity. It was the acknowledgement that control ends where another person's inner war begins. As news of his passing spread, public attention naturally returned to his films, to the roles they played in shaping cultural memory. Yet beneath those tributes ran a quieter current, a recognition that the man who spent his career telling stories about humanity had been living inside one of its hardest truths. He did not resolve it. He did not conquer it. He lived alongside it. This story does not begin with death. It begins with that sentence, spoken softly, almost reluctantly, a sentence that reveals not weakness, but honesty. A father admitting that love is not command, that guidance is not ownership, and that sometimes the bravest act is to remain present even when you cannot fix what is breaking. Rob Reiner never ruled his household with expectations spoken aloud. He did not demand greatness from his children, nor did he lecture them about legacy. And yet, legacy was always there, present without needing to be named. In families shaped by public achievement, pressure does not arrive as an order. It arrives as atmosphere. It settles quietly, shaping how a child understands worth, effort, and failure long before anyone thinks to explain those ideas. Nick Reiner was born into a lineage that American audiences already trusted. His grandfather had shaped comedy with warmth and intelligence. His father had built a career on empathy and emotional precision. Their names were not simply famous. They were synonymous with a certain moral tone, a belief that stories could make people better. Growing up inside that lineage meant that comparison was inevitable, even when no one invited it. It meant learning early that ordinary mistakes felt larger, that uncertainty felt less permitted, that drifting carried consequences beyond personal disappointment. From the outside, Nick's childhood appeared protected. But what those surroundings could not provide was permission to be unremarkable, to fail quietly, to discover himself without being measured against 2 generations of accomplishment. That absence did not announce itself as trauma. It revealed itself as tension, the kind that does not break suddenly but accumulates over time. Rob Reiner would later acknowledge that his relationship with his son was not distant, but it was not anchored either. His work required long hours, emotional focus, and constant movement between projects. Love was present, but consistency was harder to guarantee. Like many parents driven by responsibility and purpose, Rob believed he was building something that would ultimately benefit his family. He trusted that stability would compensate for absence, that opportunity would cushion uncertainty. What he did not yet see was how easily a child can interpret distance as inadequacy, even when affection exists. Nick's adolescence did not unfold in open rebellion. There were no public scandals, no early confrontations that forced intervention. Instead, there were small disappearances. Conversations shortened. Eye contact faded. Home became a place he passed through rather than occupied. These shifts were subtle enough to explain away, especially in a household accustomed to creative independence. Rob, like many fathers, told himself that growth sometimes required space, that pulling away did not necessarily mean falling apart. Alcohol entered Nick's life quietly, reportedly around the age of 15. At first, it resembled experimentation rather than escape, nothing that demanded alarm. But substances offered something Nick had struggled to find elsewhere: silence. In those moments, he was no longer a Reiner. He was not measured by potential or legacy. He existed without context. That relief, brief and deceptive, became seductive. Addiction did not arrive as chaos. It arrived as relief, and relief is far harder to fear. When Rob Reiner finally confronted his son, he did not do so with anger. He spoke carefully, slowly, believing that honesty paired with patience might still redirect the path unfolding in front of them. Nick listened. He agreed. He promised to try. Those conversations, fragile and hopeful, gave Rob just enough reason to believe that understanding could still lead to change. For a time, things appeared calmer. Promises were kept just well enough to postpone deeper questions. Hope survived, though it learned to speak more softly. Rehabilitation followed, not once but repeatedly. Each attempt carried renewed belief, followed by quiet disappointment. Rob waded through those cycles with a discipline that mirrored his work as a director. He showed up. He stayed present. He avoided spectacle. But addiction does not respond to loyalty the way stories do. It returns patiently, indifferent to effort or love. With each relapse, Rob learned a lesson no parent welcomes. Hope, when left unchecked, can become its own source of pain. At a certain point, Rob chose to confront his fear through the language he knew best. Film had always been his way of understanding people, of placing emotion into structure so it could be examined without being overwhelmed. That impulse gave birth to Being Charlie, a story about a young man lost between addiction and family, between desire for freedom and the weight of love. Rob never claimed the film was a solution. He described it instead as an attempt to understand, to speak to his son without forcing him to listen. Nick participated in that process cautiously. He observed. He stood close. It allowed them to be present without confrontation. That presence mattered. It affirmed love. What it could not do was dismantle the battle unfolding inside Nick. Understanding, Rob would later realize, does not equal rescue. As years passed, Rob Reiner adjusted his expectations. Not his love, but his belief in outcomes. He learned to lower hope without extinguishing it, to remain available without pretending control. This was not surrender. It was adaptation. It was the slow acceptance that some struggles cannot be resolved by guidance, resources, or even devotion. They can only be accompanied. This part of the story does not end with resolution, because there was none. It ended with a father learning the limits of his influence, and a son continuing to fight a battle that refused to respect lineage or love. What followed would test Rob Reiner in ways no audience ever saw, pushing him toward a truth that would later define his final years, that some stories cannot be shaped into endings, only endured with dignity. Rob Reiner did not describe the following years as a collapse. He never used language that suggested a single moment of disaster, because for him, nothing arrived all at once. What came instead was erosion. Slow, quiet, relentless. The kind that teaches you to recognize pain not by its sharpness, but by its familiarity. As Nick's struggle deepened, Rob learned that time does not always heal. Sometimes it only teaches endurance. Each return from rehabilitation carried the same ritual. Rob would wait, not publicly, not dramatically, but with the quiet attentiveness of a father who refused to step away. There were no cameras, no statements, no attempts to control the narrative. He would look at his son, searching for signs that something had shifted. Sometimes there were moments that felt promising. A clearer gaze, a steadier voice, small signs that encourage belief. But belief, once broken enough times, begins to change its shape. It becomes cautious, conditional, fragile. Addiction demanded repetition, not just from Nick, but from everyone around him. Treatment followed relapse. Relapse followed treatment. Over time, the number itself became symbolic. 17 attempts at rehabilitation were not counted to shame or dramatize. They were counted because repetition had become the defining rhythm of their lives. Each attempt required Rob to summon hope again, knowing full well how painful its eventual withdrawal could be. That was the cruelty of the cycle. Not failure, but the necessity of trying again. There were periods when Nick refused treatment altogether. Times when he disappeared from the safety of structured care and drifted instead into instability, even homelessness. For Rob Reiner, those are the hardest stretches. Not because they involved confrontation, but because they stripped him of proximity. Distance is bearable when it feels chosen. It becomes unbearable when it is imposed. Rob spoke later of nights interrupted by phone calls that said very little, yet communicated everything. A voice on the other end. A pause. Enough information to know that he had to leave immediately. Over time, even urgency loses novelty. Fear becomes procedural. What Rob never did was portray himself as a hero. In rare interviews, his tone was almost self-critical. He acknowledged moments of doubt, decisions revisited endlessly in the privacy of his own thoughts. The times he prioritized work, the moments he assumed stability would be enough. He did not accuse himself, but he did not absolve himself either. He understood something many parents resist accepting. Responsibility does not guarantee influence. Love does not grant control. At a certain point, Rob recognized that hope itself had become dangerous, not because it was wrong, but because it hurt too much when left unguarded. He described learning how to lower hope without extinguishing it. how to adjust expectations so that disappointment did not destroy the capacity to remain present. This was not resignation. It was survival. It was the emotional equivalent of learning how to breathe in thinner air. While his private life demanded more emotional energy than ever, Rob Reiner's public life began to shift as well. Hollywood, the environment that had once felt like home, no longer responded the same way. Meetings grew shorter. Enthusiasm cooled. Projects were not rejected outright. They simply stalled. Scripts were acknowledged politely and then forgotten. Promises of future conversations stretched on indefinitely. There was no dramatic dismissal, no clear ending, just a gradual withdrawal that mirrored, in an unsettling way, the distance he felt elsewhere in his life. Rob noticed it in language. People spoke his name with reverence for what had already been done, not curiosity about what might come next. Conversations began with his past achievements, as if everything that followed was an afterthought. When Harry Met Sally was no longer a shared reference point. It was a closing bracket. Respect remained, but momentum did not. For a man who had spent decades shaping emotional timing, the silence of those rooms was unmistakable. Still, he did not stop working. Work had always been his refuge, not as escape, but as structure. Writing gave shape to feelings that otherwise had nowhere to go. Directing allowed him to focus on details when life itself felt uncontrollable. Yet even this refuge began to feel different. The industry he once understood intuitively now moved according to rhythms he did not recognize. Audiences changed. Priorities shifted. Stories like his were no longer urgently sought. In quieter moments, Rob would sit alone with old scripts, not out of nostalgia, but interrogation. He asked himself whether he had changed, or whether the world had changed first. The question had no satisfying answer. Like his relationship with his son, it resisted resolution. What he did understand was that loss rarely announces itself. It arrives incrementally, offering just enough time to adjust, to normalize what once would have been unthinkable. Amid these professional shifts came a deeper personal loss. The death of his father, Carl Reiner, removed a presence Rob had relied on more than he realized. Carl had been more than a parent. He had been a moral reference point, the one voice that could challenge Rob without threatening him. After Carl's passing, Rob felt a new kind of quiet. Not emptiness, but absence. The absence of someone who understood him without explanation. The absence of a mirror that reflected both strengths and limits honestly. With that loss, Rob entered a stage of life defined less by control and more by acceptance. He no longer believed that effort alone could correct outcomes. He no longer assumed that patience would eventually be rewarded. What remained was responsibility. Not the responsibility to fix, but the responsibility to remain human in the face of things that could not be fixed. This was the emotional landscape Rob Reiner inhabited in his later years. A man celebrated for hope, learning how to coexist with uncertainty. A father who loved deeply without expecting triumph. A storyteller forced to live inside a narrative he could not shape, only endure. What followed would push these lessons to their limits, confronting him with consequences that no amount of preparation could soften. Rob Reiner entered the final stretch of his life without the illusion that things would resolve themselves neatly. By then, he understood something that had taken decades to accept. Endurance is not the same as resolution, and survival does not require answers. The years leading up to his death were not defined by collapse or spectacle, but by accumulation. Loss layered upon loss, quietly reshaping the man who had once believed that clarity, patience, and decency could guide almost any situation toward meaning. One of the most profound shifts came after the passing of his father, Carl Reiner. To the world, Carl's death marked the end of a towering career filled with laughter, influence, and cultural impact. To Rob, it marked the disappearance of his final anchor. Carl had been the one person whose opinion did not need explanation, whose approval did not feel conditional, and whose criticism never felt like rejection. With him gone, Rob found himself navigating grief without the presence that had always helped him contextualize it. Conversations that once happened instinctively were now reduced to memory. This loss did not announce itself loudly. It revealed itself in small habits. Moments when Rob would instinctively reach for the phone, then stop. Thoughts that once found clarity through dialogue now lingered unresolved. He realized that old age does not always arrive as physical decline. Sometimes it arrives as the absence of the one person who understood you before you had to explain yourself. That realization deepened the solitude he already carried from years of watching his son struggle beyond his reach. At the same time, Rob's relationship with the public continued to evolve. In his later years, he became increasingly outspoken about political and social issues. To him, this was not reinvention, nor a bid for relevance. It was continuity. He believed that having a voice came with responsibility, and silence, when motivated by comfort, felt dishonest. Yet that openness came with consequences he could not fully anticipate. Some audiences turn away, no longer able or willing to separate the artist from his opinions. Old professional relationships cooled. Conversations that once flowed easily became tense, then infrequent. Rob did not regret speaking out, but he felt the cost. He recognized the irony of becoming a polarizing figure after a career built on shared emotional ground. Films that once unified audiences across differences now felt distant in a climate increasingly defined by division. Cinema, which had long served as his refuge, no longer provided insulation from conflict or judgment. Fame ceased to be a cushion. It became a lens that magnified every stance, every word, every silence. Through all of this, Rob continued to work, not out of obligation, but necessity. Writing and directing were not escapes from reality. They were methods of processing it. Yet even work began to feel different. Projects moved slower. Interest arrived cautiously, if at all. He sensed, without needing confirmation, that the industry had shifted its attention elsewhere. This was not rejection in the traditional sense. It was something quieter, more difficult to argue against. The sense of being acknowledged primarily for what had already been done, rather than what could still be created. In private, Rob did not express bitterness. What he felt instead was recognition. The recognition that careers, like relationships, rarely end cleanly. They fade. They step back gradually, offering enough time for denial, for adjustment, for reluctant acceptance. This mirrored his experience as a father. There were no decisive moments where everything changed. Only the slow understanding that control had limits, and those limits had already been reached. Despite everything, Rob Reiner did not retreat entirely. He remained present, with friends, with his beliefs, with his family, even as that presence carried pain. He did not dramatize his suffering, nor did he attempt to transform it into a moral lesson. He carried it quietly, as something inseparable from who he had become. This restraint was not emotional suppression. It was respect for complexity. As his health declined, Rob was not known to speak in grand summaries or final reflections. There were no speeches meant to define his life. What remained instead were impressions. A man who had spent decades shaping stories about humanity, learning to live with the fact that humanity does not always offer closure. A father who loved deeply without expecting victory. A public figure who accepted that honesty sometimes results in isolation. In the end, Rob Reiner's later years were not about losing relevance or power. They were about relinquishing certainty, about standing inside a life he could no longer direct, only inhabit. The lessons he learned were not cinematic. They were quiet, unresolved, and deeply human. And it was precisely that unresolved quality that defined the gravity of what came next, when the private tragedies he had lived with for so long finally collided with public reckoning. Rob Reiner spent most of his life protecting the boundary between his work and his wounds. He believed that stories belonged to the audience, but pain belonged to the people living inside it. For decades, he succeeded in keeping that line intact. His films invited empathy without exposing his own fractures. His public appearances were measured, careful, rarely allowing glimpses of the fear that shaped his nights. But there are moments when life refuses discretion, when events force what was private into a light that cannot be softened or redirected. When tragedy finally arrived in its most irreversible form, it did not feel like a twist in a story. It felt like inevitability realized, not because it had been predicted, but because years of quiet warning had accumulated without resolution. Those close to Rob understood that this was not a single event detached from context. It was the point where long-running tension, exhaustion, and helplessness converged. The difference now was that the world was watching. Public reaction moved quickly, as it always does. Headlines searched for clarity, for angles that could compress complexity into something graspable. Speculation rushed in to fill the spaces where facts were still forming. Commentators spoke with confidence about motives, about responsibility, about meaning. Yet those who truly understood Rob Reiner's life recognized something painfully simple. This was not a mystery to be solved. It was a tragedy that had been unfolding for years, invisible because it refused spectacle. Rob Reiner did not live long enough to offer explanations or defenses, and perhaps that was fitting. He had never believed that pain required justification. In the final stretch of his life, he had already accepted that some stories resist interpretation. They do not teach. They do not resolve. They only leave behind consequences that must be carried by those who remain. For the public, reconciling the image of Rob Reiner, the filmmaker, with Rob Reiner, the father, became uncomfortable. Audiences who had grown up believing in the moral clarity of his films struggled to place this ending within that framework. How could a man so deeply associated with decency and compassion end his life surrounded by such darkness? The question itself revealed a misunderstanding. His work had never promised immunity from suffering. It had only argued that suffering did not erase humanity. In the days following his death, attention returned again and again to that sentence he once spoke so quietly. "I can direct a film, but I cannot direct my child's life." It was repeated not because it explained what happened, but because it named a truth many parents recognize but rarely articulate. That love does not equal authority. That guidance does not guarantee safety. That even relentless presence cannot replace another person's will to survive. Rob Reiner had spent years preparing himself emotionally for outcomes he hoped would never arrive. He learned to manage expectation, to remain present without illusion, to love without demanding success. When the final tragedy unfolded, it did not shock him in the way sudden loss shocks the unprepared. It confirmed something he had already accepted but never forgiven: that some battles outlast patience, resources, and devotion. What the public often misses in moments like this is the cost of endurance. Rob Reiner did not live in denial. He lived in constant adjustment. Every year required recalibration of hope, fear, and responsibility. He learned how to wake each morning not knowing what news might arrive by nightfall. He learned how to function professionally while carrying personal dread. That kind of endurance does not look heroic. It looks ordinary, and that is what makes it devastating. In the aftermath, many search for lessons. Some framed the tragedy as a warning about addiction. Others reduced it to commentary on privilege or parenting or legacy. Rob Reiner would likely have rejected all of those simplifications. He understood that real life does not operate according to moral balance, that good intentions do not neutralize illness, that responsibility does not erase randomness. What remains most striking is not the tragedy itself, but how closely it mirrored the themes Rob Reiner had explored throughout his career. His films often centered on characters confronting limits they could not negotiate away. People forced to accept that love does not grant control, that decency does not guarantee reward. In the end, his life echoed those stories, not as irony, but as alignment. Rob Reiner did not leave behind a final statement, a definitive explanation, or a guiding conclusion. What he left instead was a record of presence. A father who stayed. A man who refused to disappear into abstraction. A storyteller who understood that meaning is not something you impose on events, but something you carry forward despite them. This part of the story does not seek to answer the questions his death raised. It acknowledges them. It recognizes that some losses demand silence rather than interpretation, and it prepares the ground for what remains to be considered next. Not the tragedy itself, but the legacy of a man whose life proved that humanity is not measured by outcomes, but by how much pain one is willing to face without surrendering compassion. Rob Reiner left behind no final thesis about suffering, no tidy moral that could be quoted and reused. What remains instead is quieter and more demanding. It asks the listener to sit with ambiguity, to accept that some lives are measured not by resolution, but by persistence, not by victory, but by presence. In the aftermath of everything that surrounded his later years, that distinction matters. Reiner's career had always been built on emotional literacy. He understood how people listen, how they lean in, how they retreat when confronted too directly. His films never shouted their values. They invited audiences to discover them through recognition. Love was never perfect in his stories, only earnest. Decency was never triumphant, only necessary. Looking back from the vantage point of his final chapter, it becomes clear that this was not simply an artistic preference. It was a worldview shaped by limits. As a father, those limits became personal. Reiner learned that responsibility does not confer power, that showing up does not guarantee transformation, that patience can coexist with fear without resolving it. These realizations did not harden him. They refined him. He did not withdraw from compassion. He practiced it with fewer illusions. He learned how to remain open without expecting rescue, how to love without assuming control. That is not a lesson easily communicated. It is learned through endurance, and it carries a cost that rarely shows on the surface. In public memory, Reiner will always be associated with warmth, with humor that did not humiliate, with romance that did not condescend, with coming-of-age stories that respected uncertainty rather than mocking it. Those qualities did not fade as his personal life grew heavier. If anything, they became more legible. His insistence on dignity, even when circumstances offered none, feels less like optimism in hindsight and more like discipline. There is a temptation, after tragedy, to retrofit meaning, to search a life for signs that everything pointed toward an inevitable conclusion. Reiner's story resists that impulse. Nothing about his later years suggests surrender. He did not retreat into silence or bitterness. He continued to engage, to speak, to work, to care. What changed was not his commitment, but his understanding of outcome. He stopped expecting fairness. He stopped confusing effort with authority. He accepted uncertainty as a permanent companion rather than a temporary condition. That acceptance does not read as peace. It reads as honesty. And honesty, in the face of pain, is often mistaken for resignation. Reiner never resigned from the values that defined him. He simply refused to pretend they guaranteed safety. This refusal placed him at odds with a culture that prefers stories of redemption over stories of endurance. It also explains why his final years felt quieter, less celebrated, yet more revealing. The legacy he leaves behind is therefore not a cautionary tale, nor a moral parable. It is a record of how a person remains human when solutions fail. Reiner showed that empathy does not require success to be authentic. That love does not need resolution to be real. That responsibility is not measured by results, but by refusal to disappear. For audiences revisiting his films now, the experience changes subtly. Lines once heard as charming carry added weight. Moments once played for warmth now resonate with restraint. His characters often pause before speaking, as if considering the cost of honesty. That pause feels intentional in retrospect. It mirrors the space Reiner learned to inhabit in life, where words mattered not because they solved anything, but because they acknowledged reality without distortion. In the broader cultural conversation, Reiner's life challenges a familiar narrative. We are accustomed to believing that wisdom arrives with answers, that experience accumulates toward clarity. His story suggests otherwise. Sometimes wisdom arrives with the ability to remain present when clarity never comes. Sometimes maturity is learning how to carry unresolved questions without letting them erode compassion. As time passes, public attention will shift, as it always does. Headlines will fade. Speculation will quiet. What will endure is not the noise, but the texture of a life lived attentively. A filmmaker who believed that stories mattered because they helped people feel less alone. A father who stayed even when staying offered no guarantee. A man who understood that the hardest stories are not the ones we tell, but the ones we live without the power to edit. Part 6 does not close the narrative. It reframes it. It moves the focus away from outcome and toward presence, away from explanation and toward endurance. What follows is not an attempt to resolve what cannot be resolved, but to consider how such a life is remembered, not as a symbol of tragedy, but as evidence that compassion can survive even when certainty does not. Rob Reiner will not ultimately be remembered for the way his life ended, but for the way he continued long after certainty disappeared. Time has a way of softening noise while sharpening meaning. As distance grows from the events that dominated his final chapter, what remains is not scandal or speculation, but a deeper understanding of the kind of life he lived and the price he paid for remaining present when retreat would have been easier. Reiner's story resists simplification because it resists comfort. There is no neat arc that carries him from struggle to redemption, no final victory that validates the endurance that came before it. That absence is precisely what makes his life instructive. In a culture that values resolution above honesty, Reiner's refusal to manufacture meaning stands as an act of integrity. He did not pretend that suffering could be redeemed by narrative alone. He accepted that some experiences do not resolve, and that dignity lies in how one inhabits them. As a filmmaker, Reiner always trusted audiences to recognize truth without being guided to conclusions. He understood that people are capable of holding contradiction, of feeling warmth and discomfort simultaneously. That trust extended into his life. He did not curate his pain for public consumption, nor did he weaponize it for sympathy. When he spoke carefully, not to explain himself, but to acknowledge reality without distortion. That restraint, often mistaken for detachment, was in fact a form of respect. The relationship between his work and his life becomes clearer when viewed through this lens. His films rarely end with triumph. They end with connection, with characters choosing presence over certainty, compassion over control. These are not abstract ideals. They were rehearsals for a life that would later demand the same choices without the relief of a closing scene. Reiner understood, perhaps earlier than most, that stories prepare us not for success, but for endurance. In the years following his death, audiences revisiting his films may notice something different. Not sadness, but gravity. Lines once delivered with lightness now carry restraint. Silences linger longer. Humor feels gentler, as if aware of its own limits. This shift does not diminish the joy his work provided. It deepens it. It reveals that joy, in Reiner's world, was never denial. It was resistance. As a father, his legacy is not measured by outcome, but by refusal to abandon. He stayed present in circumstances that offered no reassurance. He learned to love without expectation, to guide without authority, to hope without illusion. These are not lessons that translate easily into advice. They are dispositions formed over time, through repeated confrontation with powerlessness. Reiner did not master them. He practiced them. Public narratives often demand heroes or failures. Reiner fits neither category. He lived in the uncomfortable middle where most lives actually unfold. He succeeded without being invulnerable. He suffered without becoming bitter. He spoke without claiming certainty. That combination is rare, and it explains why his story continues to resonate even without resolution. In the end, Rob Reiner's life asks a difficult question, not of audiences, but of anyone who believes that love should be rewarded with control. What does it mean to remain human when influence ends? What does it mean to care deeply without the promise of change? What does it mean to continue telling stories about hope while learning how to live beside uncertainty? In the final weeks of his life, Rob Reiner was carrying a weight that very few people around him could see. To the public, he remained the celebrated filmmaker whose career had shaped modern American cinema. To those who knew him best, especially Billy Crystal, something quieter and more troubling was unfolding behind closed doors. It would only become visible after tragedy struck, when grief forced private conversations into the light and reframed an entire friendship through the lens of regret. The shock arrived swiftly. Rob Reiner and his wife, Michelle Singer Reiner, were found dead in their Brentwood home, a place long associated with warmth, conversation, and decades of shared memories. News of their deaths rippled through Hollywood, not merely as another loss, but as an event that felt profoundly dissonant with the life Rob had lived. For Billy Crystal, the news landed with a different weight. It did not arrive as a complete surprise, but as the devastating confirmation of a fear he had carried silently for weeks. Billy later spoke of a conversation that had taken place shortly before the tragedy, one that now echoed in his mind with painful clarity. According to his recollection, Rob had asked him to come over, insisting that it was not about work, not about a film, but about something personal. When Billy arrived, he sensed immediately that his friend was not himself. The familiar ease was gone. The house felt quieter than usual. Rob looked exhausted in a way that could not be explained by age or professional stress alone. When Rob finally spoke, he did so carefully, as if weighing each word. He told Billy that things inside his family had become increasingly difficult, and that he felt worn down by worries he had kept to himself for far too long. It was not anger that defined his tone, but fatigue. A father's fatigue. Rob spoke of his son Nick's struggles, of relapses and unpredictable behavior, and of arguments that left him unsettled rather than resolved. For the first time, he admitted that he no longer felt certain he could anticipate what might happen next. Billy listened, troubled by what he was hearing. He understood Rob's instinct to protect his child at all costs, yet he could not ignore the warning signs embedded in his friend's words. He told Rob plainly that love alone might not be enough, that boundaries mattered, especially when tension had moved inside the home itself. Rob heard him, but his response revealed the conflict tearing at him from within. He could not bring himself to see his son as a threat. He feared that pushing too hard might cause an even greater collapse. That conversation ended without resolution. Rob promised to think things over, to reconsider after the holidays. Billy left with an unease he could not shake, replaying the details in his mind long after the evening had faded. It was not fear in the dramatic sense, but a quiet sense that something was out of balance, slowly drifting toward a point from which it might not return. When the tragedy later became public, Billy found himself revisiting that afternoon again and again. He paid close attention to early reports, not searching for spectacle, but for coherence. Certain details felt wrong to him, not because they contradicted facts, but because they clashed with the man he had known for nearly half a century. Rob was decisive, attentive, especially where family was concerned. The prolonged silence surrounding the discovery of what had happened felt deeply unfamiliar. As more information emerged, Billy's private worry transformed into a heavy burden of self-questioning. He did not rush to conclusions. Instead, he reflected on patterns, on what Rob had confided, and on the moments when he himself had hesitated. The realization that warning signs may have existed long before the final outcome haunted him, not as an accusation, but as a reminder of how easily concern can coexist with inaction. This was not simply the loss of a collaborator. Rob Reiner had been Billy Crystal's closest friend, the first person he called with good news, and the one he turned to when doubt crept in. Their bond, forged decades earlier and immortalized through films like When Harry Met Sally, was rooted not just in shared success, but in trust. To lose Rob was to lose a part of his own inner life. In the days following the discovery of what had happened inside the Brentwood house, the story surrounding Rob Reiner began to shift. What initially appeared as an incomprehensible rupture slowly took on the shape of a long, unfinished struggle, one that had unfolded quietly inside a family that, from the outside, seemed firmly held together. For Billy Crystal, this shift was not driven by rumor or spectacle, but by memory. He found himself tracing backward, aligning fragments of what he had heard, what he had sensed, and what he had chosen not to confront directly. Billy did not speak publicly at first. Those close to him said he moved through the days in a muted state, absorbing details without comment. What troubled him most was not a single revelation, but the accumulation of small irregularities that echoed Rob's earlier confessions. The house in Brentwood had never been a place of long silences. It was known for its rhythm, people coming and going, conversations stretching late into the evening. The idea that so much time could pass without anyone responding felt discordant, almost unnatural to someone who knew that household intimately. As reports emerged describing how the scene was discovered, Billy's mind returned repeatedly to one specific thought. Rob had once said that when tensions rose, they did not explode all at once. They moved from one room to another, in stages. That memory, insignificant at the time it was spoken, now lingered with unsettling clarity. Billy did not claim to understand what had happened, but he could not ignore how closely the outline of events mirrored the emotional patterns Rob had described weeks earlier. Another detail that weighed heavily on him was the separation within the house. Rob and Michelle were not found together. For Billy, this carried an emotional resonance more than an investigative one. It suggested movement, interruption, and a situation that had not remained contained. The idea that a familiar domestic space could become fractured in that way made the loss feel even more intimate, as though the private order of daily life itself had been broken beyond repair. When Billy learned that Rob's son was not present when the bodies were discovered, his unease deepened. He did not rush to judgment, but the absence connected instantly to the fear Rob had once voiced, the fear of unpredictability. Rob had spoken openly about how difficult it had become to anticipate his son's reactions during moments of stress. Hearing that Nick was not there in the aftermath reopened that conversation in Billy's mind with painful intensity. Over time, additional context emerged, much of it circulating quietly within the entertainment community before reaching wider awareness. People who had attended a holiday gathering the night before spoke in hushed tones about an argument, about behavior that felt unsteady, about a tension that lingered even after the evening ended. For Billy, these accounts did not introduce something new. They reinforced what Rob had already confided, that the family was living under a strain that had grown heavier than anyone wanted to admit. The subsequent detention of Nick Reiner only intensified Billy's internal conflict. Seeing images of him in custody was deeply unsettling, not because of the legal implications alone, but because they represented the collapse of a hope Rob had guarded fiercely. For years, Rob had believed that staying close, remaining present, could help guide his son through instability. That belief had shaped countless decisions, including creative ones. One of those decisions was the film Being Charlie, a project that carried more personal meaning than most people realized. To Billy, it was clear that the film had been more than an artistic endeavor. It was an act of faith, a father's attempt to reach his son through storytelling when other paths seemed blocked. Knowing this made the unfolding events even harder to reconcile. The effort, the patience, the belief that something could still be salvaged, all seemed to have dissolved in the most devastating way possible. As legal proceedings moved forward, Billy followed them from a distance. He did not attend press briefings or offer analysis. Instead, he listened quietly to what was being said by investigators and legal insiders. Phrases like internal family dynamics and sequence of events still under review confirmed what he already felt, that this was not a tragedy imposed from the outside, but one that had grown from within, shaped by years of unresolved tension and fear. What weighed on Billy most was the realization that Rob had been trying to protect everyone at once: his wife, his son, the fragile balance of their household. In doing so, he had carried the burden largely alone. Billy wondered whether a firmer intervention, a louder insistence, might have changed something. Yet even as the thought arose, it dissolved into uncertainty. The truth was that Rob had not ignored warnings. He had simply hoped that love would be enough to soften the edges of a situation that had already hardened over time. As the story transitioned from shock to investigation, Billy felt himself retreat inward. Friends noticed he stopped appearing in places where he was usually present. Invitations went unanswered. He spent long hours alone, replaying conversations, examining pauses, questioning his own restraint. The tragedy had not only taken Rob and Michelle from the world, it had forced Billy into a reckoning with the limits of friendship, the moments when understanding does not automatically translate into action. As the legal process began to take shape, the tragedy surrounding Rob Reiner entered a colder, more procedural phase. Court filings replaced speculation. Timelines were reduced to dates and hours. What had once been private anguish was now being examined through formal language, stripped of emotion. For Billy Crystal, this transition was disorienting. The man he had known as a friend, collaborator, and confidant was no longer being spoken of in terms of laughter or creativity, but as a figure at the center of a criminal case. Billy followed developments quietly, relying on what filtered through trusted contacts rather than public commentary. The details were difficult to absorb. Reports emphasized the sequence of events leading up to the deaths, the hours that remained unclear, and the questions investigators were still trying to answer. Each update felt less like new information and more like a reopening of wounds Billy had been attempting to keep sealed. Every reference to family tension or unresolved conflict echoed conversations he wished he had handled differently. What unsettled him most was how methodical the process felt. The legal system moved forward without regard for memory or meaning. It focused on actions, evidence, and responsibility. Yet Billy's mind refused to operate within that structure. His thoughts drifted instead toward moments of hesitation, the silences between sentences, the pauses where he might have pressed harder. He understood that responsibility could not be assigned retroactively to conversations that had already passed, but understanding did little to ease the sense of failure he carried. The absence of Rob's voice was particularly jarring. Rob had been someone who spoke directly, who rarely left emotions unresolved. To see his life reduced to statements read aloud by others felt profoundly wrong to Billy. It reinforced the sense that something essential had been interrupted, that a narrative which should have continued had been forced into an abrupt and unnatural conclusion. As the case advanced, attention inevitably turned toward Rob's son, whose struggles had been known privately for years but were now exposed under an unforgiving spotlight. Billy found this exposure deeply troubling. He remembered the way Rob spoke about his son, not with frustration, but with a careful tenderness that suggested fear as much as love. Rob had worried constantly about what too much pressure might do, about how quickly stability could fracture. Seeing those fears become public discussion only intensified Billy's grief. In conversations with close friends, Billy admitted that he felt torn between two unbearable truths. On one hand, he recognized the necessity of legal accountability and clarity. On the other, he could not reconcile that necessity with the memory of a family struggling, imperfectly but earnestly, to hold itself together. The courtroom language left no space for that complexity. It demanded clean lines where none had existed. During this period, Billy withdrew further from public life. Appearances were declined. Interviews postponed indefinitely. Friends noticed a marked change in his routines. He woke early, slept little, and spent long stretches of time alone, revisiting old correspondence and unfinished thoughts. Messages that once carried humor now felt unbearable to read. Each one seemed to whisper the same accusation, that there had been time, and that time had been wasted. The emotional weight was compounded by the realization that Billy's role in Rob's life had been uniquely significant. Their friendship had lasted nearly half a century, surviving career shifts, personal changes, and the relentless churn of the entertainment industry. Rob was not merely a colleague. He was a constant, someone who had helped anchor Billy's sense of self. Losing him in such circumstances created a fracture that extended beyond grief into identity. Billy also struggled with anger, though it rarely found an outlet. It was not directed at Rob, nor at the legal system, nor even clearly at the person accused. Instead, it turned inward. He questioned the nature of loyalty, wondering when it becomes indistinguishable from avoidance. He asked himself whether respect for a friend's autonomy had blinded him to the urgency of intervention. These questions did not seek answers. They circled endlessly, unresolved. The more Billy reflected, the more he recognized a painful paradox. Rob had trusted him enough to confess his fears, yet Billy had trusted Rob's judgment enough to step back. Each man believed the other capable of navigating the situation. That mutual trust, once a source of strength, now felt like a shared miscalculation. It was not betrayal that haunted Billy, but alignment. They had seen the same danger and responded with the same restraint. As the media continued to cover the case, Billy remained silent. Those close to him understood that speaking publicly would require composure he did not possess. Every attempt to articulate his feelings threatened to dissolve into regret. Silence, though heavy, felt safer than words that might fracture under their own weight. Yet beneath that silence, something else began to take shape. Billy started to realize that his grief was not solely tied to the outcome of the case, but to the abrupt end of a dialogue that had defined his adult life. Rob had been someone with whom he could question, argue, and reflect. Without that presence, Billy was forced to confront uncertainty alone. The legal process might eventually reach conclusions, but it would never answer the personal questions that mattered most to him. With time, the noise surrounding the case began to fade into a distant, persistent hum. Headlines moved on. Speculation softened into routine updates. Yet for Billy Crystal, the absence left behind by Rob Reiner only grew more pronounced. Grief did not recede. It reorganized itself, settling into the corners of everyday life where memory has the most room to breathe. Billy began to revisit the early years of their friendship, not as an act of nostalgia, but as a way to remember Rob beyond the final chapter. They had met when neither knew how enduring their bond would become. The connection was immediate, rooted in shared humor and a mutual respect for craft. Over the decades, that connection matured into something rarer than professional collaboration. It became a quiet understanding, the kind that does not require constant affirmation. As Billy reflected, he realized how much of Rob's identity had been shaped by responsibility. Rob was not only a director or a public figure. He was a husband deeply devoted to Michelle Singer Reiner, and a father who measured his own success not by accolades, but by the well-being of his children. That sense of responsibility had driven his creative choices, his activism, and the way he structured his private life. It also explained why he carried burdens silently. Rob believed that holding things together was part of who he was. This realization brought Billy a fragile kind of clarity. Rob had not been naive. He had been deliberate. He understood the risks that surrounded him, yet he chose patience over confrontation, closeness over distance. Billy could see now that Rob's decisions were not the result of denial, but of faith. Faith that family bonds could absorb strain. Faith that time might soften what force could not. That faith, however, came at a cost. Billy recognized that Rob's tendency to protect others often meant exposing himself. He had absorbed tension so that others would not have to. He had postponed decisive action in the hope that understanding might prevail. Billy did not judge these choices harshly. Instead, he saw them as the product of love shaped by fear, a combination that rarely announces its limits until they are exceeded. In quieter moments, Billy found himself thinking about Michelle as well. She had been a steady presence, someone who balanced Rob's intensity with calm resolve. Their partnership was built on shared values and mutual respect. Losing her alongside Rob compounded the sense of injustice. It felt as though an entire center of gravity had vanished at once, leaving behind not just grief, but disorientation. As weeks turned into months, Billy began to speak more openly with a small circle of friends. These were not conversations meant for public consumption. They were halting, reflective, and often unfinished. In them, Billy explored the uncomfortable space between compassion and accountability. He acknowledged that love does not excuse harm, yet he struggled with the idea that understanding must be stripped of empathy. Holding both truths at once felt exhausting, but necessary. Gradually, Billy recognized that part of his pain stemmed from the abruptness with which the narrative had closed. There had been no final conversation where Rob reached resolution, no moment of reassurance that everything would be all right. The ending arrived without consent, leaving Billy to carry questions that had no one left to answer them. In that silence, memory became both refuge and burden. Despite this, Billy resisted the temptation to reduce Rob's life to its final events. He reminded himself, repeatedly, that tragedy does not erase meaning. Rob's work continued to exist, carrying laughter, insight, and humanity to audiences who might never know the personal struggles behind it. That work was not diminished by how his life ended. If anything, it stood as evidence of a man who understood complexity and contradiction. This perspective did not absolve the pain, but it offered balance. Billy began to see that honoring Rob meant preserving the fullness of who he was, not allowing his legacy to be overshadowed by a single catastrophic moment. It meant remembering the generosity, the curiosity, and the unwavering belief in storytelling as a force for connection. As the months passed, grief began to take on a quieter form. It no longer arrived as a sudden wave, but as a steady presence that followed Billy Crystal through ordinary moments. A pause before answering the phone, an empty instinct to share a thought, a laugh that stopped short because there was no longer someone on the other end who would understand exactly why it mattered. In this phase, loss was no longer loud. It was intimate, woven into habit. Billy gradually came to understand that what he was mourning was not only the death of Rob Reiner, but the disappearance of a shared future. For nearly 50 years, Rob had been a fixed point in his life. They had grown older together, adapting to changes in the industry, in politics, in family life, always assuming that time remained. That assumption, once invisible, now felt like the most fragile thing of all. Friends noticed that Billy began to speak differently when Rob's name came up. There was less pain in his voice, but more weight. He no longer focused on the final weeks or the unresolved fears. Instead, he returned to earlier memories, moments that captured Rob's essence without being overshadowed by the ending. Long walks filled with debate. Late-night phone calls dissecting scripts, ideas, and doubts. These recollections did not erase sorrow, but they restored dimension. They reminded Billy that Rob's life had been expansive, not defined by its conclusion. This shift did not happen easily. Billy struggled with the fear that moving forward might feel like abandonment. Letting grief soften felt disloyal at first, as if pain were the final proof of devotion. Over time, however, he began to see that clinging to anguish did not honor Rob. It trapped him in the moment of loss rather than in the decades of connection that preceded it. Part of this realization came through conversations with others who had loved Rob. When they gathered privately, away from cameras and formal statements, the tone was different. They spoke of Rob's humor, his impatience with complacency, his deep respect for collaboration. Stories overlapped, reinforcing a shared understanding of who he had been. In those moments, Billy felt less alone. Grief, once isolating, became communal. Billy also found himself reflecting on the nature of warning signs. The question of whether something could have been prevented lingered, but it no longer dominated his thoughts. He began to accept that foresight is rarely as clear in real time as it appears in hindsight. Love complicates judgment. Loyalty delays action. These are not moral failures, but human limits. Understanding this did not absolve regret, but it placed it within a broader, more forgiving frame. As the legal process continued in the background, Billy chose not to engage with its daily developments. He recognized that justice and memory operate on different timelines. The courts would determine responsibility. His task was different. It was to safeguard the truth of a friendship that could not be reduced to a case file or a headline. This separation allowed him to breathe again, to reclaim parts of his life that had been suspended in shock. One of the most significant changes was Billy's gradual return to creative work. At first, it felt impossible. Every project seemed trivial against the weight of what had happened. Yet, as time passed, he began to recognize creativity as one of the few spaces where Rob's influence remained alive. Rob had always believed in storytelling as a way to make sense of chaos. Returning to that belief felt less like moving on and more like carrying something forward. Billy did not speak publicly about Rob often, but when he did, his words were measured and deliberate. He avoided dramatic conclusions, choosing instead to emphasize complexity. He spoke of love that tries to protect and fear that hesitates, of families that struggle privately while appearing whole from the outside. These reflections were not confessions. They were acknowledgments of reality in its most uncomfortable form. In quieter moments, Billy also began to forgive himself, not in a sweeping, final way, but in fragments. He allowed himself to accept that friendship does not grant control, only presence. That advice, no matter how well-intentioned, cannot override another person's choices. This acceptance did not erase the ache of what might have been said or done differently, but it loosened its grip. In time, remembrance replaced rumination. What remained for Billy Crystal was not the urgency of unanswered questions, but the responsibility of carrying a story forward without distorting it. He understood that the final chapter of Rob Reiner's life would always draw attention. Yet he felt increasingly certain that the meaning of that life could not be measured by its ending alone. Meaning lived elsewhere, in choices repeated over decades, in the way a person shows up for others when no one is watching. Billy began to notice how Rob's presence continued to surface in unexpected ways. In conversations with younger filmmakers who spoke about collaboration rather than control. In rehearsals where actors felt safe enough to take risks. In stories that balanced humor with vulnerability instead of treating them as opposites. These echoes were not accidental. They were the residue of a philosophy Rob had practiced consistently, one that valued people as much as outcomes. As Billy reflected on this, he recognized a subtle shift within himself. The guilt that once dominated his thoughts gave way to a more sober understanding of limits. Friendship, he realized, is not a safeguard against tragedy. It is a witness to it. The role he had played in Rob's life was never to manage outcomes, but to bear honest presence. That presence, though imperfect, had been real. Accepting this did not erase sorrow, but it restored proportion. There was also a growing awareness that silence had served its purpose. Billy did not need to speak often, but when he did, he spoke with care. He resisted simplified narratives and refused to assign neat lessons to a story that resisted them. Instead, he acknowledged ambiguity. He spoke of families that love fiercely and struggle quietly, of warning signs that only become obvious in retrospect, of the human tendency to believe there will always be another conversation, another chance to intervene. In honoring Rob, Billy chose restraint over spectacle. He supported tributes that emphasized craft, collaboration, and the dignity of work done with integrity. He avoided public debates about blame. That choice was not avoidance, but protection. It safeguarded the memory of a friend from being flattened into a single, sensationalized account. It allowed complexity to remain intact. Privately, Billy continued to hold space for Michelle as well. He spoke of her not as an appendix to Rob's story, but as a force in her own right, someone whose steadiness had shaped the household and the values it reflected. Remembering her alongside Rob felt essential. Their partnership, built on shared commitments and mutual respect, had been part of the fabric Billy mourned. Separating their remembrance felt dishonest to the life they had lived together. As the seasons changed, Billy returned more fully to the rhythms of his own life. Work resumed, not as distraction, but as continuity. Laughter returned, sometimes unexpectedly, sometimes with hesitation. He learned that joy did not cancel grief. It coexisted with it, reminding him that emotional life is rarely linear. Rob had understood this truth intuitively, weaving it into stories that allowed audiences to laugh and ache within the same breath. The question of prevention never disappeared entirely, but softened into a broader reflection. Billy came to see that responsibility is often shared unevenly across time. Decisions made in good faith can still lead to irreversible outcomes. Recognizing this did not absolve anyone, but it did challenge the notion that clarity is always available when it is most needed. The past, viewed through loss, acquires a sharpness that reality rarely provides. In conversations with close friends, Billy described his current relationship to the tragedy as one of stewardship. He felt tasked with preserving truth without embellishment, compassion without denial. This balance required patience. It demanded that he resist both cynicism and sentimentality. It asked him to remember Rob not as a symbol, but as a person who navigated love, fear, conviction, and doubt with the same complexity as anyone else. In the end, what endured was not the tragedy itself, but the responsibility of memory. For Billy Crystal, the task was neither to resolve unanswered questions nor to extract simple lessons from irreversible loss. It was to remember Rob Reiner in full, without allowing the final chapter to eclipse the chapters that came before it. Memory, Billy learned, is not passive. It requires intention, accuracy, and restraint. He began to think of remembrance as an act of care. Care for truth, so that stories did not drift into exaggeration. Care for people, so that grief did not become spectacle. Care for complexity, so that love and fear were allowed to coexist without being forced into tidy conclusions. This approach felt faithful to Rob's own sensibilities. Rob had always resisted simplification, whether in his work or in his private life. He believed that honesty lived in nuance. As time moved forward, Billy noticed how easily narratives hardened around moments of crisis. Public conversations leaned towards certainty, toward the comfort of definitive explanations. He understood that impulse. Ambiguity unsettles. Yet he also knew that certainty can erase the human texture of lived experience. In private, Billy continued to hold onto uncertainty, not as avoidance, but as respect for realities that could not be neatly parsed. The friendship he shared with Rob had been built on conversation, not consensus. They argued, challenged each other, and laughed through disagreement. That dynamic did not end with Rob's death. It transformed. Billy found himself continuing those conversations internally, asking how Rob might have responded to an idea, a line of dialogue, a moment of doubt. In this way, the friendship persisted, not as illusion, but as influence. Billy also became more attentive to the quiet signals of strain in the people around him, not with the belief that vigilance could prevent every tragedy, but with a renewed sensitivity to fatigue, withdrawal, and unspoken worry. He understood now how easily concern can be masked by competence, how responsibility can look like stability from the outside. This awareness did not make him more controlling. It made him more present. When asked privately whether he believed anything could have been changed, Billy no longer tried to answer definitively. He spoke instead about timing, about how clarity often arrives too late to be useful. He acknowledged regret without allowing it to become a verdict. Regret, he said, is not proof of failure. It is evidence of care encountering limits. That distinction mattered to him because it allowed sorrow to remain humane rather than punitive. In honoring Rob, Billy chose continuity over closure. He supported projects and conversations that reflected Rob's values, collaboration, curiosity, and moral seriousness without didacticism. He encouraged younger artists to trust complexity, to resist fear-driven simplifications, and to remember that humor and gravity are not opposites. These are not grand gestures. They were practical expressions of a legacy that had always favored substance over display. Michelle's memory remained inseparable from this process. Billy spoke of her as part of the same story, not as an addendum. He remembered her steadiness, her intelligence, and the way she anchored the household that had welcomed so many conversations over the years. To separate their remembrance felt inaccurate. They had lived as partners, and they were remembered as such. As years continued to unfold, Billy accepted that some questions would remain unresolved, and that this was not a failure of understanding. It was the condition of being human in the presence of loss. He learned to live with the echo rather than chase an answer. In that acceptance, he found a quieter form of peace, one that did not erase pain but made room for gratitude. There is no answer offered here, because Reiner himself never offered one. He lived the question instead, quietly, persistently, without illusion. And in doing so, he left behind something more durable than explanation. He left a model of presence, a reminder that dignity does not require solutions, that compassion does not depend on success, that the measure of a life is not found in how it concludes, but in how it is carried when certainty is no longer available. This is where the story rests, not resolved, not redeemed, but complete in its honesty.